Introduce you and we're good to go. Uh, Thank you for joining us today and welcome. This is Managing Feedback and Revising Your Writing. This is for the Student Undergraduate Research Experience at the University of Saskatchewan, so the SURE program. My name is Myrtle Massey, and with us today is Liv Marken, who's the Writing Centre Coordinator at the University of Saskatchewan. And with that, I'm going to turn off my video and mute and turn it over to Liv. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Merle. I'm going to share my slides. First, again, I just wanted to thank you for being here today. I know it's a stressful time of year. A lot of stuff seems to be due after the break, which is unfortunate, but that's how it's going. And we're hot into midterms and soon we'll have papers due. So I'm hoping that this can help you with your written midterms as well as your papers and anything you're working on for publication or poster presentations. So here we go. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint. I've done this many times, but I still seem to make errors. Okay. I'll start from the top. So my name is Liv Marken, and you're welcome to contact me anytime if you have any questions about accessing writing support on campus or about accessing any resources that we have to recommend. You probably or maybe already know that writing help is free to all University of Saskatchewan students. So the library provides kind of full circle research, reading, and writing support. All of those things you need when you're working on a paper will help you with any kind of writing. It doesn't have to be academic writing. And our tutors come from across the discipline. So there are about 26 tutors right now, and they come from the sciences, social sciences, health sciences, humanities. So I try to find tutors from a range of disciplines so that if you, for example, submit a lab report or you're having a question about APA, I can assign it to a tutor who really knows that area and who can help you. So you can access appointments via WebEx or you can email at any stage of the writing process. So my job is to hire and train those tutors, and I sometimes offer writing support myself in more complex cases, but please contact me anytime if you have any questions. All right, so today we have a fair amount to cover. I know everybody loves it when a presenter says that, but I'm hoping that this will be a really practical session for you. We're not going to get too deep into grammar and proofreading. We're going to concentrate more on higher order concerns, HOCs we call them in the writing studies world. So we'll look at some editing tips, things that I've found over the many years I've been teaching on campus to be kind of really resonate with students and have really helped me in my own writing as well. A lot of them are kind of little light bulb moment approaches when it comes to editing. And then we're also going to talk about managing feedback, how to deal with it on a kind of psychological level, how to understand it and how to be systematic about it and how to seek advice. All right, so we're going to talk about a couple of things. First of all, something I call the top to bottom trap, and then we'll look at higher order concerns and lower order concerns. So the top to bottom trap is often what we do when we approach our drafts or when we look at somebody else's work for that matter. So when we're working through a draft, I like to print and work on paper. I know it's wasting paper, but something tactile about getting in there with a pen really appeals to me. But if whether you're working on your word processor or you're working on a printout, try to have a more global look at the higher order concerns before you become concerned with proofreading. Also try to avoid proofreading as you go along when you're drafting. This can be really tempting if you're a student who excels. You may have some perfectionistic tendencies and you may want to correct as you go, and that can become a real waste of time and really inefficient, because if you think about it, there's no real point proofreading sentences or paragraphs or sections that are going to get cut in the editing process anyway. So don't bother worrying about correctness and proofreading, punctuation, spelling, all of that stuff. Try not to correct as you go. Try to maybe even turn off your Grammarly or anything that you're using if you're not using it for composition reasons like predictive text or anything like that. If you turn off like the little squiggle lines in Word, that can actually stop you from being perfectionistic about it, and you can turn them on later and see all the ways in which you failed. But I like to not have that voice in my head as I'm drafting. I want to kind of think, okay, I need to express thoughts here in a clear way, thinking about an audience, but not thinking about judgment from that audience just yet. So when I say top to bottom, what you want to avoid is sentence by sentence, and instead look at higher order concerns. So I've listed them on the left column here. And this is also what we do in the Writing Center. When students come, they often come in wanting help with punctuation and proofreading, and we definitely help with that. And if you want help with that, we will help you with that. But what we very often see is that there's larger concerns or issues that are actually going to affect your grade or how clear you are or how successful you are in communicating something through paper or whatever format you're using, poster presentation, for example. So there are things that we will mention in passing if we happen to notice, well, yes, we know you want help with punctuation, but your thesis statement could use some improvement, and that will have more of an impact on your mark, if you want to think cynically, than punctuation. So, I mean, it kind of depends on the prof, but generally that is really true. So in writing studies, we call these higher order concerns. So at the top of the list, I would say some of these really apply to if you're seeking publication, and there are things that journals look at. We do at USearch, the first thing we look at are all of the concerns listed under ethical. So USearch is the University of Saskatchewan Undergraduate Research Journal. So looking for things like poor paraphrasing, poor integration of evidence, and then we start looking at audience, purpose, organization, is it clear, where are the snags, like where is it not making sense, and so on. So first of all, for ethical, if you're submitting something for publication, you might think first about using any figures which you don't have copyright permission for. Is there a conflict of interest involved? Do you know one of the editors of the journal, for example, and that needs flagging? Have you paraphrased properly? Have you been accurate in representing others' points of view? Have you respected people's privacy? If you're going to present the information outside the context of your course, do you have ethics approval to do that? Have you checked into that? Is there language bias? Language bias, there's the new APA guide. Even if you're not using APA in your field, the American Psychological Association citation style, their guide online has a really clear outline for and very up-to-date outline for avoiding bias in research, but also in language and in writing. So I would recommend that resource. And we have a workshop on that topic as well. If you're interested, contact me and I can send you the recording of that. Also think about if you have co-authors, have they been informed? So those are really the most important things before you go to hand in a work, submit a work, present a work, or anything like that. And then the next higher order concerns are, now you're ready to look at, if you want to be systematic about it, you're ready to look at sort of like the bird's eye view, the overall structure. So there are a few analogies for this. Structure, I like looking at architecture and thinking how that applies to different kinds of writing. Like you might have more creative writing that maybe looks like a Frank Gehry building, where you have like big swooping designs, or where he takes a piece of paper, crumples it up, and tells his architect's assistants, make this into a building. So quite disorganized. So and then you have highly structured kind of writing when it comes to scientific writing, where you have quite a prescriptive set of sections that you need to adhere to that are common from a scientific field to scientific field in general. I also like to think about the bird's eye view or the balcony view. So I know when I wrote my thesis, I spread out a chapter on the floor, I printed it out just to see where there were imbalances. So I might have paragraphs that were a little undeveloped, some that were too long that needed splitting. So a bird's eye view is an important part of initially when you're confronted with your draft, just scanning for structure. For structure, one thing that's helpful is to look for repetition. So we're often taught not to repeat ourselves in writing. And so that can really lead us to missing out on opportunities for what's called good repetition, or what I call good repetition. So there's repetition where you're just kind of saying the same thing over and over and not coming out the other end and not explaining. there's good repetition where you connect the dots for the reader by repeating keywords or key terms or repeating pieces of sentences that came before in order to connect them a little bit better. So we're going to talk about that in a bit. One thing, I've got a young woman here who's posted some Post-it notes. This is a technique that one of my tutors told me that she uses. She uses color when she's planning a paper out. She uses color coding, and she kind of can move the Post-it notes around in a way that gives her that bird's eye view of how the paper might be structured or how her arguments are going to be formed or the things she needs to do in order to complete each of those sections. And then it's flexible, you can move it around. And there's digital ways to do that as well. Tools like Padlet, for example. So you want to be clear about your purpose. We've talked about structure in very general terms because we don't have time to do a deep dive on that today, but we certainly have resources on that with the Writing Centre if you need them. So for purpose, we often kind of go through the motions of being good students and doing our assignments and following directions, but I know when I was an undergraduate student, and I'm not, that was a long time ago, I know, and I'm not saying that you're like this at all, but it didn't occur to me until maybe in my later years to think, why are they asking me to do this? Why am I writing this assignment? Or why am I performing this experiment? What's the larger context? And being outside of a discipline or new to a discipline, it's hard to imagine why it's important. So talking to your professor or your supervisor to ask them, look, I'm really curious about this assignment. Like, why did you come up for it and why is it important in your field? So not confrontational as in, why are we doing this? But more, this is interesting. Like, why are we doing this? I'd really like to know the impetus and what you're hoping we'll learn. I mean, they usually list learning objectives that I know when I was a student, I didn't bother to read those. That can be a clue. But I've picked a really easy example because we're all thinking about vaccinations. Maybe I shouldn't have put this example in because we're tired of thinking about this topic, but say one of your assignments, you're in public health and you are assigned to create a pamphlet on vaccines and it has to be readable and clear for a general audience. Why? So what? Why did you do it? What are the implications of the analysis that you did? You need to articulate the meaningfulness of what you did quite overtly, especially if you're writing for an audience outside the expert audience. So within the context of a class, if your professor is your assumed audience, you maybe can skip certain articulations of purpose unless you're wanting to demonstrate that you understand the purpose. But when you're trying to articulate things in a context outside of your class, it's very important to be quite clear. You may think you're being really obvious about it, but probably people aren't really as plugged in to the topic as you and aren't really thinking about purpose unless it's clearly stated. So it might seem often obvious to you, but you've got to articulate quite clearly what it is you're doing. Another piece with purpose is to show how your research connects to a larger concern or a widespread concern, which might take some, like a bit of side research, and to name the wider significance. The papers that you're drawing on, the journal articles that you're reading will probably do this, so watch how they do it and look at the language they use and how they contextualize the importance of particular highly technical studies sometimes. So for example, this example I picked out. So say for example, you have examined the efficacy of MCT oil, an MCT oil ketogenic diet on children with drug-resistant epilepsy. Why should the average person care about that? Well, epilepsy is one of the most common neurologic conditions in children. It affects between 0.5 and 1% during childhood, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when children have drug-resistant epilepsy, it's quite devastating. So one thing that some researchers have looked into in a review paper is supplementing the ketogenic diet, which was a ketogenic diet. We think of fitness fanatics with ketogenic diets. It's a very popular diet now for weight loss. But it was initially created for epileptics in the 20s or 30s. And so a very high fat, low carbohydrate diet puts the body into ketosis, which actually can really help people with epilepsy. And they don't need to go on this really extreme diet unless they have perhaps drug-resistant epilepsy, and then they try to under hospital supervision, get the child into a state of ketosis. And if you supplement with something called MCT oil, which is a type of fat, it's an easy supplement because it's flavorless. So I've learned a lot about that topic because I have a family member with epilepsy, so I did that research myself. So if you think about why somebody would care, why would the average person care about this? Try to make it interesting to them without, being manipulative or exaggerating, of course, but think about why the average person might care. In the humanities, you might see things a little bit different. So you might be talking more about the purpose of your paper might be more along the lines of where it fits in the scholarship, how it's, what theories you're using, the theories that inform it. And the statement of purpose is not so overt. So you wouldn't be announcing in your introduction, the purpose of this paper is to analyze the use of the word do in Macbeth, which is an actual paper that I read. It was really fascinating. But you don't really announce purpose in a really obvious way in the humanities. So next time you're reading a humanities paper publication, think about how they subtly communicate purpose or context. Okay, so audience. So a little quotation here, Aristotle, sorry. Rebecca Bennett, I think, is giving a presentation to this group, or maybe it's to another group, but she talks about this, if you're in the College of Engineering or Agriculture and you've taken RCM courses, you will have learned about this. So it is, you think about persuasion not so much of it in the terms of like a sales job or anything like that. It's more about engaging your audience so that they believe you and they want to read on. So do you have an expert audience? Do you have a fictional audience? Do you have a public audience? So think about how you use what are called ethos, pathos, and logos. So these come from Aristotle. So ethos is how you convince your audience of your credibility. So for example, in this presentation, I could have started, which I didn't, but I could have started with, my name is Liv Marken, and this is my degree, and these are my qualifications, in a way that's like a little more natural than just robotically listing my resume. But I think I maybe missed an opportunity to boost my credibility. I did say my job title. So how you convince your audience of your credibility is not so overt when you're writing a paper. It's more about things, so when you're new to a discipline, so somebody like Merle, for example, has a PhD in history and she's expert in certain areas. And so she has inherent credibility because of the years of study she's put in and what she knows and what she's published. So we trust what she has to say about the areas that she knows about, that she's studied. But if you're new to a field, you have to do a little extra heavy lifting in order for outside people to pay attention and to trust you. And so the credibility that you have to work with as a student is through good writing. So grammar, punctuation, formatting, care to detail, correctness, understanding your audience, taking care to research your audience and to understand what they need to know, and good use of evidence. So these are ways that you can convince your audience of your credibility. And I've just created some simple examples here of poor ethos. So in this example, a student is asking for an extension. The pieces that I've highlighted here, it might be a little hard to see. I maybe should have used a different color, but the word Mrs. is highlighted, the plus side instead of the word and the happy face are ways that the writer undermines their credibility. So they are assuming, they haven't read they've assumed that the instructor, because they're female, that they're a Mrs., but that's an assumption that could be left out and maybe use professor instead. And using an emoticon in a formal request is probably a little too informal. And using a plus sign shows like a hastiness, so maybe you neglected to read it over one more time before you sent it in. So that's poor ethos. Logos is where it's what we're using and flexing a lot in academic writing. Importantly, we need to do this. So this is sort of where we bring in the numbers, the statistics. Sometimes in qualitative versus quantitative research, that will really look different, what counts as evidence. So here's an example, though, in this simple example, again, of what's wrong with the logos in this request. So the logos is really missing. There's no evidence that they need an extension, so they haven't provided evidence. So this is a very simple example instead of going into an entire research paper. Pathos. Here's an example of the same student writing the request in an overly emotional way. So they've manipulated the appeal to emotion, and they've appeared to, so pathos is really appealing to fear, pity, guilt, popularity. Sometimes it's really abused with nationalistic rhetoric, which we've seen a lot of in the world lately. Appeal to tradition. So pathos is dicey. I would not use it without really understanding what you're doing. So responsible pathos is really more about communicating shared attitudes or beliefs or values. It can be used to arouse interest. So for example, talking about children, just even that fact, which we might think of as logos, children who have intractable epilepsy who need other interventions besides medication. That appeals to emotion in a way that's not manipulative. It's a statement of fact that to most people would arouse interest or sympathy. You can think of it as human to human qualities within your paper. And it's also important to know your audience in terms of how to use this effectively. So in academia, we tend to favor less emotional, more remote kind of approach. But we can definitely use pathos effectively. So here is, I would say, a pretty good persuasive request for an extension. So the ethos here, how you convince your audience of the credibility, which is what we looked at first. So how are you credible? They've addressed the Professor Mackenzie. It's formatted nicely. He uses the words I understand and we in order to show that, look, I'm a credible person here because I've obviously been engaged in the class. I see us as being a part of a group, we, and I'm showing my understanding. The intention is announced, what he is, so that boosts his credibility because it shows that they would like to. It shows that he's showing that he's already done some work on it, what I've already completed. He is using the word ask instead of just telling the instructor that he needs the extension. And polite language is used with the word please and thank you for considering, shows that he's not assuming that he's going to get that extension. So that's ethos. He's built his credibility through the structure and careful language. In logos, that's really the facts and figures. And so here we have the date, the time, how long they've been sick, specifically how many days for extension that they need, and he can provide the evidence of a doctor's note. And pathos, I think, is quite carefully used. The word I understand and our INTS class, and you would appreciate, and thank you for considering. So you can see that it's not manipulative, but it shows that they've thought about their audience and they've been considerate of their audience. All right, just a quotation from another Writing Centre website, because I do want to reemphasize to be careful with pathos. An appropriate appeal to pathos is different than trying to unfairly play upon the audience's feelings and emotions through fallacious, misleading, or excessively emotional appeals. Such a manipulative use of pathos may alienate the audience or cause them to tune out. It can really backfire, in other words. All right, we'll get into a bit more detail on the HOCS and LOCS now that we've talked about kind of those really bird's eye view sort of things that we've been talking about and some of the ways to be persuasive and think about audience and purpose. So let's look at some of the more tangible things that you can dive into once you've looked at those other things. The old new information pattern, I don't know why, but I only learned it a few years ago, and I have to credit my former colleague Heather McWhinney for exposing me to this concept. She's a graduate writing expert, and it's a way for you to communicate connections that are not obvious to you in a very simple way. And it really shifted my writing and how I write. All right. So when you don't use the old new information pattern, you can create disorientation with each new sentence. So you've probably experienced this without realizing it, but if you're reading a paper or a textbook, I was reading a student having a skim through a student sociology textbook last night, and I was like, this could really benefit from old new information pattern, because I felt like I was falling asleep with each new paragraph because I couldn't keep a grip on what it was talking about. So the end of each sentence should have an element that repeats at the beginning of the next sentence. And this is what I'm talking about when I say good repetition. And there are ways to finesse this and do this in a way that's not so robotic and kind of hard on the ear. So new information, this is a kind of a flawed, it's grammatically fine, but it's just new information is thrown at the reader at the beginning of each sentence, which it can be, again, disorienting. They have to think about a new topic every time they start a sentence. So you can revise it with a little bit of repetition. So some repetition can be really helpful for being clear. So we have, we try to provide optimal growing conditions for crops by using soil additives to adjust soil pH. So soil pH is the information that's in the reader's head, the new information, we could call it if they were reading previously. And if that information is repeated early in the next sentence, that creates that chain, that link in the chain that makes it easier for the reader to follow along and reduces that disorientation. So the old information, now that is called old information. So it was new information, now it's old information. So one way to raise the pH of the soil is an additive made from pulverized chalk called garden lime or agricultural limestone. Agricultural limestone is often added, et cetera, et cetera. So those two words, that phrase agricultural limestone is repeated. And to me, before I learned this pattern, I would have thought that was really not great or brazen. And you just have a rule in your mind that shouldn't repeat. Maybe those sentences should be combined in order to avoid the repetition, which would be a great solution as well. But if you have like starting to build longer sentences, having this bit of repetition is actually so helpful to your reader. And it helps me to stay on track too when I'm writing. It helps me to stay organized. All right, so that's my little tip about old new information pattern. Another higher order concern is thinking about sentence variety. So when we have different types of sentence variety in our drafts, when each sentence has this sort of a different type, whether that's actual length, word count, or grammatical structure. So there are three types of sentence in English: the simple sentence, compound, and complex. If you have a kind of natural variation in those lengths and types, the writing will feel a lot more natural and easy to read. So when you think about writing that flows, we often think that is like almost like an art form to get your writing to flow. And it really is quite technical how you do that. And good writers will probably most of the time not even think, oh, I'm using sentence variety. They're just doing it naturally. It's like you have an ear for it. You think about, you know, the short sentence followed by a longer sentence, followed by another short sentence. It can create that kind of, you see journalists using it in a more dramatic way than we do in academic writing. They'll use like a really short or one word and then a period and then a new paragraph. And then, so you can get quite exciting with it that way, but you don't need to do that in academic writing. It can be a bit more subtle than that. So I'm not going to go into the grammatical differences between simple, compound, and complex because that's a workshop for another day, but we do have presentations on that. I think there's one actually happening today, and we'll have the recording up for that. So contact me if you'd like the recording for that. So that's one type of sentence variety. The other type is short, medium, and long. So I've taken this example here of a medium, this paper from Nature, just published last year, uses the 3 different grammatical structures. So these 3 different sentence types, but they're also different sentence lengths. Structure, type and length don't necessarily correspond. You can have quite a long, simple sentence, and you can have quite a short, complex sentence. But the first sentence is a complex sentence because it uses a conjunctive adverb, the word because. So if you just Google the word conjunctive adverb, you'll get a list of conjunctive adverbs, and they're words like if, when, although, because, and what they do is start to show relationships between things in a sentence. So you can take 2 sentences and combine them by making one of them dependent, which means adding a subordinating conjunction. So if you're not using subordinating conjunctions in your writing, that probably means you're not writing complex sentences. So you're missing out on that opportunity to show clear relationships and to create variety. The next one is quite short. It's a simple sentence. And the final sentence is a compound complex sentence. It's actually, I would say, let's just call it a compound sentence. It uses a conjunction, it uses and to separate 2 full sentences. So the conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Fanboys is the acronym. And where you're using these to separate 2 full sentences, when you're using them to separate 2 full sentences, you're creating a compound sentence. So this is a good example because it shows sentence variety in length and in type. All right. Another thing that is great to learn about are zombie nouns. Just gotta find my speaking notes because I've gone off the rails here. Okay, so they're called nominalizations. It's just fun to call them zombie nouns, but what they do is really suck the life out of your writing. There's a great TED Talk that's animated. I love an animated talk. I'm a very visual person. And it just makes things like grammar a lot more interesting if you can have an animation. So there's this TED Ed talk on zombie nouns that would be great to watch. There's also a book called The Writer's Diet by Helen Sword. She's a professor at the University of Auckland, and it's a wonderful skinny book, which I guess reflects the title of the book. And it's very visual as well. And if you're gonna invest 20 bucks, maybe even try to find a used copy or go to the library. It's a great short little book that will, the tips in it go way beyond what I'm talking about today, but will have a profound impact on the clarity of your writing. So the zombie nouns really take the energy out of your writing because you're using nouns when you could be using verbs. And verbs, of course, are like the engine of the sentence. They give it energy and they make it go and they make it precise. So, for example, the example here, sorry, my face is covering up I gotta move that. The nouns used with prepositions and weak verbs. So has an effect on the performance of the medication, has applicability for. We use this language all the time and there's nothing grammatically wrong with it, but it can have and it's fine to use it from time to time, but it can deaden your writing. It can make it a snooze fest. Not that you want your scientific writing to necessarily be exciting or creative or anything like that. We're just talking about crisp, clear, plain, direct. We want our writing to have energy in that sense. So instead of has an effect on, you could write instead such and such affects Y, whatever it is. Instead of the performance of the medication, we could say X performed, the medication performed well on da 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 da. So taking the noun, effect, performance, applicability, and promoting it to a verb, giving it a little promotion, a new job, and now it's a verb and it's going to make your writing more clear. Unclear pronouns, this is a very quick one. You can catch these by just going through your paper and looking at where you start sentences with this. So you'll notice profs circling like this what or unclear pronoun reference. So use that old new information pattern, for example, can help you to remember what it is you need to repeat in the next sentence. This is my favorite. So when I was an undergraduate student, I think I was in first year, I was in first year. I took my paper to my prof and I was very keen. That's okay. Thanks for coming. So what he taught me was, he looked at my drafts and he said, I'm not going to give you any comments. What I want you to do is to go to your word processor and click Control F, or I think it's Command Open Apple, something on a Mac, whatever, the find word function, and look for these words, and where you see them, try to revise to get rid of them. He said, you're not going to get rid of all of them. You don't need to, but it will really help you to tighten your writing. And he called it the symptom check because these words aren't the illness. These words are a symptom of the illness. So it's almost like taking the temperature and saying, "Ooh, got a fever here." I'm using a lot of these words. So for example, this sentence uses a lot of them. This is the young woman who was elected to be president by the group. So can anybody suggest to me how we might revise the sentence to get rid of some of those, if not all of them? And think about it in terms of reordering the sentence. So you can get, like, sometimes we write a sentence, we can't imagine it being written any other way, especially if we've written it. But if you just start moving chunks around, you can kind of play around with those blocks and things will click into place. So if anybody wants to just turn off their mic and interrupt with the revision, or type it in the chat. Nobody? Thank you. The young woman has been selected for the post of president by the group. Yep, so we're still starting with the young woman. We've gotten rid of this is, has been selected, okay. Sure, elected Veda as president, nice. So one thing Merle did there that was really helpful was putting the doer of the action first, and that's called active voice, where you think about, okay, in this sentence, who's doing the action? Who's doing it? Put that first and have them do the action. So here, the woman is being elected, it's passive. So if you put the group at the beginning of the sentence, everything kind of clicks into place and you can get rid of, you notice that a lot of those symptom words fade away. So the group elected this young woman president, for example. Some people might leave in to be president, and that's okay as well. But in the second revision, we've got 50% reduction in the length of the sentence. And if you end up doing this and you realize your sentences are very short, start combining them using and or but or transitional expressions, for example. So you can whittle them down, but I would encourage this because it's going to make your writing a lot more clear and direct as it accumulates over time. If you're using passive voice a lot, you're gonna be less clear and you're gonna be more wordy. Here's an example that I've just revised. It had there are, who, have, it is, who, and by as symptom words that lit up when I did Control F. And then if you can just get rid of there are, and then you have that kind of domino effect of, okay, now we can get rid of who, yeah. And then if you get rid of it is. So one little tip there, side tip, is where you're starting sentences with there are, or it is, or this is, you're kind of backing yourself into a problem of wordiness. So try to avoid starting sentences that way. I would recommend, and I'm not going to show this because we don't have time. I didn't plan to show it today, but go to this website, Manchester Phrase Bank. It is fantastic. We send a lot of grad students to this site, but it can benefit anybody. So it gives you commonly used phrases for doing the things that are listed here in parentheses. It's fantastic. There's also a good handbook from University of Wisconsin Writing Centre, transitions, creating transitions. So this will help with those higher order concerns. So Merle, do we have 8 minutes or like 15 or so?
15.
Okay.
You're
so
good.
We have time. Yeah. So just before we move on to managing feedback, does anybody have any tips they want to share or have any questions about what we've talked about today?
I always share my favorite tip, and that is that every book or article or anything that I've ever sent out for publication, I read the whole thing out loud.
Yes.
And I find all kinds of things that, like, if I'm stumbling over it speaking it, other people will stumble over it and it will catch their mind as they're reading. So if I'm stumbling at when I'm speaking, then I find that I go back and I fix that sentence. So that's one of my favorite.
Yeah, and I can't believe I forgot to mention that. That's like one of the things we say about 25 times a day at the Writing Center is, have you tried reading this out loud? Yeah, it's fantastic. And, you know, if, even better if you read it out loud into to a person. Um, you can hit those spots where it's like you can see a little wash of confusion, or you might stop and just flag, okay, might need a bit more explanation. To think more vividly of an audience can be helpful. I know one student read to their dog. They don't want to talk to a human, or even record yourself reading it and then listen back to catch things as you're looking at the draft. But that's a really important one. Thank you, Merle. All right. So how do you deal with it? One thing I had to learn over time is, you may have learned this, it's quite common now to learn about growth versus fixed mindset. So it comes from a researcher, I believe at Stanford, Carol Dweck, who taught, she's a psychologist who studied students, university students, elementary school students, and she looked at how, kind of like taught them about brain plasticity and how it's possible to learn to really do, to improve over time, which seems like really basic. It's like practice makes perfect. But a lot of us don't talk to ourselves that way, or we do in some domains and not others. So in sports, we might say, well, I didn't do that right. I just have to do it more and more, and then I'll get good at it. But we don't think that in that detached way with writing, or vice versa. So I know that I am insecure about sports. So I'll do something once and I'll be embarrassed and I won't ever do it again, instead of just realizing I just have to practice. It's the same with writing. So if you just talk to yourself in a nicer way, say, instead of I'm a bad writer, think these are the exact things I need to work on in my writing, and I can do that. I can get better over time. So the other part is detachment. So writing is artificial. So it's kind of like, it's not natural to human beings to write. We like gestures, we like voice intonations, we like to communicate verbally. We're more naturally create verbally because we have a whole set of nonverbal cues that we can use that we can't use on the printed page. So writing has its limitations, and there are things you need to do to make up for that. So don't be hard on yourself if you've written something and get a bad mark or it's covered in red ink, which is not great marking strategy from your profs, but it happens. Look at that and think, okay, I just didn't communicate it. I just got to figure out in a detached way that this doesn't reflect that I'm a bad person. This just means I haven't got it yet. So look to people who are good writers and ask them, like, how did they learn? What do they do? Take in new information, just like you would in any other domain of your life. Another thing to do is to be systematic. So when you see a paper that's marked up, if somebody's even edited your paper, they've proofread it and gone through and marked everything, that can be really overwhelming. But if you were to sit down and write down everything that they noted, you get a lot of things repeated. And we see that every day in the Writing Center. We'll see the student is doing the same 5 mistakes over and over. It's not that they are committing every crime in the English language. They are just, they've got a pattern of error. So if you can start tracking your pattern of error and just use Google, like just Google, like, okay, what's the problem here? Unclear pronoun reference, Google it and find out how to fix it and how to identify it. Or come to the Writing Center with your marked paper and we'll go through it with you and help you to learn and give you more examples. We won't, we have students come in with their marked paper saying, do you think I should have got a higher mark? And we're like, we cannot comment on that. That's up to your professor. But we can go through the paper with you and help you to get better. So be systematic about it and track. That'll take some of the emotion out of it and it'll help you to really focus how you get better. You want to seek advice. So you're not alone. We see in the Writing Center, we see it all. So we see postdocs, we see first-year students, we see high school students who are able to take an early university class. We see students who really struggle with writing, who really struggle with writing. We see students who excel, everything in between. So please remember that you're not alone. We're not going to judge you. We don't share information with your professor that you've come for a visit. If you think, oh shoot, I don't know if I'm plagiarizing, we won't handcuff you and report you to the authorities. We'll teach you how to cite, we'll teach you how to paraphrase. So it's a really safe place where you can get help, and there are lots of other things that you can do. I think the best thing you can do is talk to your prof and say, thanks for the feedback, instead of coming across as like grade grubbing, like, I don't know, can I get a few more marks? Come across as, I really want to become a better writer. Like, how did you learn how to become a better writer? What things did you learn? Like, just ask them about their own experience. Guaranteed they weren't as good as they are now. Guaranteed they're still learning how to write well. So get a mentorship going in that way, or talk to your TA. The other one is, this is something that English majors are good at, and because Merle's here, I'm going to say history majors are good at this as well. I don't usually say that, but I think I'm going to start now, Merle. Is reading not just for content, but thinking about how something's made. So it's kind of the difference between that car works, its engine runs, versus opening the hood and saying, how does it work? So when you're reading an article in the field that you aspire to write in, read for content, sure, but also think about how's it made? Like, if it's good and it's clear to you and you like how it's constructed, think about, okay, what language do they use? How did they create that transition? How did they establish context? Look at the word choices they use. Ghassan El Yassin, he gave one of these workshops on publishing. He's the former editor of USask and a PhD student in medicine. And he loves stealing words from other writers, just individual words. It's not plagiarism, but he'll be like, oh, I like that word. And he'll write it down, and he's got like a little notebook, and he gets excited about certain words. So think about how other experts use language. All right, I put that in there by mistake. I'm just going to end with a couple of quotations, one from Irish writer James Joyce. And I like this one because, I mean, it's a bit mystical, but I still really like it because it's so true that when we're making mistakes, we discover so many things. That's our way to improve. That's our way to always be growing. So think about how you approach mistakes. And I also like to use this quotation because I think a lot of university students are very hard on themselves and very perfectionistic and might hide the fact that they're making mistakes, but it's so important to be vulnerable and to share with each other and to learn from each other. Another quotation is from a really good writing guide from Royal Roads that was informed by Coast Salish elders, and it's called the Four Feathers Writing Guide, and it's intended for Indigenous students, but it has good information for anybody. And this is a paraphrase of some of what the elders were some of what the elders were communicating to the creators of the guide. During your time as a student, you'll learn new stories as well as new ways to tell them. And that knowledge will be essential to knowing more about yourself and your studies. So it's not just about telling the story in your writing. It's not just about what you're writing about and the information you're communicating. It's also about learning more about yourself and your abilities and about your audience and about what is the whole point? Like, why are we engaging in scholarly writing? Why are we jumping around doing all kinds of different writing as students? These are not just hoops we're jumping through. They're really ways that we can come to understand ourselves and other people. So on that sentimental note, I am going to end. There is time for questions. Here are some resources that I think would be helpful. I put some specific science writing resources because I find that general writing advice and writing resources online tend to be written by people from the humanities and a little bit too geared example-wise to people from the humanities, which is my area, but I can understand that. And so I put a few examples there that I think are good websites. And I'd also add to that list any of these, anybody, not just science students, the Manchester Phrase Bank. I put existing literature on this list because that's where you're, like that analogy I was talking about, looking under the hood and seeing how things work. So look at how people write, not just what they write. All right, so talk to supervisors. If you're majoring in a subject and using a citation style very consistently now as a senior student, I'd recommend getting a workshop on how to use a citation manager like Zotero. it can save you a lot of time. So, any questions, anybody?
I'm just going to jump in and remind everybody that we have some Citation Manager webinars, both on the library and in the Sure YouTube channel. So if
Yes,
you
that's
are
right.
looking for a specific citation, or spend that 45 minutes first, watch that webinar, and it will save you lots of grief afterward. I agree.
Yeah. It's quite the. I was looking at all the Sure workshops. It's quite the treasure trove of information. It's amazing.
And we add to it all the time because this one's going to go there too. Thanks, Liv. I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you.